The deputy's hand was resting on his holstered pistol. Not a threat, just a fact. He was looking at me, then at the magnificent 200-year-old oak tree behind me, its massive branches reaching for the sky. A bright red ribbon was tied. Around its trunk, a mark of death. On the path, a tree-cutting crew with chainsaws stood waiting like vultures. And in the middle of it all was Penelope, the president of the Blackwood Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, her face a mask of triumphant rage. "He's trespassing, officer," she declared, her voice ringing with the absolute certainty of the truly entitled. "This is HOA common property. This hazardous tree was scheduled for removal for community safety, and this man is interfering, is a squatter from that derelict cabin down the road. I want him removed and charged." I stood on the soft, mossy ground my family had walked on for a century, a silent guardian for a tree that had been here since before this country was even a dream. The deputy took a step toward me, his expression hardening. He saw a powerful community leader on one side, and a quiet, unassuming man in a flannel shirt on the other. He had already made his decision. He was going to make me leave. He was going to let them kill my tree. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files. To understand why I was willing to get arrested for a single tree, you have to understand my grandmother, and you have to understand the forest. My name is Elijah. For the last 10 years, my life was in a university lab. I'm a biologist, botanist. My world was one of microscopes, DNA sequencing, and the quiet, intricate language of the natural world. My grandmother, Elspeth, was a different kind of scientist. She was a force of nature in her own right. A fierce, brilliant, and deeply reclusive woman. She had inherited a modest timber fortune in the 1960s, but instead of living a life of luxury, she did something extraordinary. She took her entire inheritance and piece by piece bought the entire Blackwood Forest, 5,000 acres of pristine, old-growth Appalachian wilderness. She bought it to save it from the logging companies that were circling, to preserve it as a living laboratory and a sanctuary. When she passed away last year, she left it all to me. Not just her small rustic research cabin, but the entire forest, and the massive, complex family trust she had established to protect it. I was overwhelmed, humbled, and terrified by the weight of the responsibility. I left my university job and moved into her cabin, the same simple structure she had lived and worked in for 50 years, to begin the monumental task of becoming the forest's new steward. There was one exception to my grandmother's wilderness preserve. Back in the early 90s, to create a financial buffer for the trust, she had agreed to a 99-year land lease for a 200-acre parcel on the southern edge of the property. A developer, promising a loom-packed, environmentally sensitive community, had built Blackwood Ridge Estates. It was an exclusive, gated community of massive, modern homes, a small island of civilization in my vast green sea. The residents of Blackwood Ridge owned their houses, of course, but the land itself, the ground beneath their perfect lawns, the manicured common areas, the scenic walking trails, all of it was on land leased from my grandmother's trust. And the lease agreement, a document as thick as a phone book, is a masterpiece of environmental protection. It's filled with ironclad covenants restricting any unapproved construction, any clearing of land, and most importantly, the cutting of any tree with a trunk diameter of more than 12 inches. And the new queen of this lease kingdom was Penelope. Penelope was the HOA president, former high-powered CEO from New York who had retired to the mountains to, as she put it, tamed her own little piece of nature. She saw the forest not as a living ecosystem to be preserved, but as a backdrop, an amenity, a resource to be managed and exploited for the benefit of the residents. Our first meeting was a perfect omen. She drove her gleaming black Porsche SUV up the winding dirt path to my cabin, a vehicle completely unsuited for the terrain. She looked at me, in my simple work clothes, and at my grandmother's rustic, moss-covered cabin, with a look of utter bewilderment. "Hello," she'd said, her voice sharp and appraising. I'm Penelope, the HOA president. I don't believe we've been introduced. You're the caretaker. Something like that, I'd replied. My name is Elijah. My grandmother, Elspeth, passed away. The property is mine now. I see, she said, her eyes already scanning the area with a critical gaze. Well, you should know, Elijah, that the board has some significant concerns about the state of this parcel. The overgrown nature of it is a fire hazard and an eyesore. We have a list of approved landscaping companies. Strongly suggest you hire one and begin to tidy up this mess. We have standards to maintain at Blackwood Ridge. She was standing on my private deeded land that was not and never had been part of her HOA, and she was giving me orders. I politely informed her of my property's separate legal status. She just waved a dismissive hand. A technicality. We're all one community here, and we will all abide by the same rules. The first formal declaration of war arrived a week later. Notice of violation from the HOA was left tacked to my cabin door. The violation? Maintaining a firewood pile that was not in a board-approved, aesthetically pleasing container. My neat, functional stack of split oak was, in her eyes, a crime. I was more annoyed than anything. My lawyer, the old wise man who also managed the trust, sent a calm, firm letter back to the HOA, politely but unequivocally reminding them that they had absolutely no jurisdiction over my property. Penelope's response was to simply invent jurisdiction. A new letter arrived from her lawyers. It claimed that because my property had a significant visual and environmental impact on their community, and because I used their main gate for access, a right granted in the original deeds, the HOA had inherent oversight rights to ensure my property did not become a nuisance. It was a complete and utter fabrication of legal authority. At the same time, I started noticing things. Things that made the hair on my arms stand up. On my walks through the forest, on the land that was part of the HOA lease, I started seeing new, unapproved structures. A fancy, ornate gazebo being built in a clearing where rare orchids grew. New, wider trails being cut through sensitive wildlife habitats. And then, the worst discovery of all. Stumps. The fresh, raw stumps of mature, healthy oak and hickory trees. Well over the 12-inch limit that had clearly been cut down to improve the scenic views for a few of the multi-million-dollar homes on the ridge. The anger that had been a slow simmer in my gut for weeks erupted into a full roaring fire. This wasn't about my firewood pile anymore. This was about my grandmother's legacy. This was about the forest. They weren't just bad neighbors, they were bad tenants. They were actively, willfully violating the sacred terms of the land lease. The very document that gave them the privilege of living here. I had my lawyer send a formal, notarized notice of lease violation to the HOA board. It was a brutal, multi-page document, detailed every single breach of the environmental covenants, from the illegal gazebo to the cutting of protected trees. It included dated photographs and surveyor's reports, gave them 30 days to cease all unapproved activities, to submit a plan for the removal of the gazebo, and to pay a significant fine to the trust's conservation fund for the destroyed trees. It was a final warning. Penelope's response was the ultimate act of defiant, arrogant escalation. It was an act of pure, calculated spite. The day after she received the notice of violation, she sent a work crew, the same crew that had been cutting the other trees, and had them tie a bright red ribbon around the trunk of the most magnificent, most ancient, most beautiful tree on my property. The 200-year-old oak tree that was the heart of my personal, private, non-leased land. She then sent a community-wide email, a masterpiece of manipulative propaganda, claiming that this ancient, hazardous tree on the edge of the community common area was at risk of falling and had to be removed for the safety of the children. She was going to cut down my tree on my land and frame it as a heroic act of public safety. And that's what led to the standoff. Me standing in front of the tree, refusing to move. Her accusing me of being a dangerous squatter, and a sheriff's deputy caught in the middle, about to make a terrible mistake. As the deputy told me I had to leave the HOA common property, as the chainsaw operators revved their engines. With a hungry snarl, I knew the time for quiet warnings was over. "Officer," said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering. "Please, just wait one moment." I can clear all of this up. I walked back to my cabin, my mind a whirl of cold, focused rage. I went to my grandmother's desk and pulled out the thick, leather-bound portfolio, the one that contained not just the lease, but the original master deeds to the entire valley. I walked back out and approached the deputy. Penelope was scoffing. More delays, more tricks. Just arrest him. I ignored her. First, I unrolled the official, notarized survey map of my own private 100-acre parcel. "Officer," I said, pointing to the clearly marked boundary line and the massive oak tree that was a full 50 yards inside it. "As you can see from this official county record, this is my private property. The tree is on my land. Ms. Penelope and her work crew are the ones who are criminally trespassing." The deputy took the map, his eyes scanning the professional markings. He looked at the tree, then at the map, then at the foreman of the tree. "Crew," his expression hardened. "You and your men need to stand down and wait off the property," he told the foreman. "This is a property line dispute." Penelope's face went white with fury. "This is ridiculous. He's faked that map." "But the tree is the least of your problems today, Penelope," I said, my voice now as cold as the mountain stream. And then I made my final move. I turned to the deputy, who was now looking at me with a new, grudging respect. "Officer," I said, "the real issue here is not a single tree. It's the entire 200-acre community of Blackwood Ridge." I then pulled out the master land lease agreement. It was a thick, imposing document bound in blue leather, the original from 1992. My lawyer, who I had called on my way back to the cabin, had just arrived, and he stepped forward, taking the document from me. He introduced himself to the deputy, and then turned to a now confused and very nervous Penelope. My lawyer said, his voice calm and authoritative, "I am the legal counsel for the Blackwood Forest Preservation Trust, which my client Mr. Vance now manages. As I'm sure you're aware, your entire community is built on land that is leased from our trust. That's an administrative detail," she snapped, though her confidence was visibly failing. "On the contrary," my lawyer said, "it is the most important detail of all. Your HOA under your leadership has been in material breach of the environmental covenants of this lease for some time. We have documented the illegal construction of a gazebo and the unauthorized destruction of numerous protected old-growth trees." He handed the deputy a thick file of evidence, the photos, the reports, our own notice of violation we had sent her. Penelope was starting to tremble. She knew she was caught, but she had no idea what was coming next. My lawyer then pulled out a final single piece of paper, pursuant to Section 18 of the Master Land Lease Agreement. A material breach of the environmental covenants by the lessee gives the lesser my clients trust the right to immediately void the lease in its entirety and retake full possession of the property. Stepped forward and handed the document to a now catatonic Penelope. "This," he said, his voice ringing with a terrible finality, "is a formal legal notice of lease termination and eviction. For the entire Blackwood Ridge Estates community, your lease has been terminated due to your own willful violations. You and every other resident of this community have 90 days to vacate the premises. You are all being evicted." The world seemed to stop. The chainsaws were silent. The birds in the forest were silent. The deputy just stared, his mouth hanging open. And Penelope looked at the eviction notice. She looked at the forest she had treated as her personal backyard. She looked at me, the quiet man she had dismissed as a squatter. Her face crumpled, low guttural, animalistic sound. Of pure, abject despair escaped her lips. The fallout was a nuclear explosion. The entire community of Blackwood Ridge was thrown into a state of absolute chaos and terror. They discovered in the most brutal way possible their multi-million-dollar homes were on land they didn't own, and that their HOA's arrogance was about to make them all homeless. Penelope was not just a pariah. She was the most hated woman in the state. She was immediately removed from the board in a panicked, screaming emergency meeting that nearly devolved into a riot. She was facing a massive class-action lawsuit from her own neighbors. A new, terrified HOA board, along with a team of high-powered lawyers, representing the homeowners and their now panicked title insurance companies, came to me begging for it. Negotiation, and I, the quiet botanist they had tried to have arrested, was now their undisputed landlord, holding the fate of their entire community in my hands. I didn't evict them. Grandmother had allowed them here, and I would honor that. But on her terms, not theirs. I used my newfound absolute power to restructure the very foundation of their community. We drafted a new ironclad lease agreement. HOA was dissolved and reformed as the Blackwood Ridge Conservation Trust. I held a permanent controlling seat on the board. A massive portion of their annual dues was now diverted into a reforestation and land restoration fund to repair the damage they had done. All future construction, landscaping, even the color they painted their houses, was now subject to a strict environmental review conducted by me. This whole brutal war taught me a lesson that I think my grandmother always knew. People who are obsessed with controlling their own tiny, manicured patch of lawn often have no idea who owns the ancient, powerful forest that surrounds them. Penelope thought my grandmother's legacy was just a bunch of inconvenient trees that were blocking her view. She learned the hard way that those trees had deeper, stronger roots than she could ever possibly imagine. The new conservation trust is working surprisingly well. The residents, now faced with the truth of their situation, have a new, humbled respect for the forest they live in. But Penelope, as part of her own massive lawsuit against the original developer for failing to properly disclose the terms of the land lease, has just subpoenaed my grandmother's private journals, looking for any loophole, any weakness, any secret she can use to try and claw her way back.